Juice runs down your wrist before you've even finished the first bite. A mango, split open, orange flesh catching the light. You don't think about it, you just chase the next bite before the sweetness fades, before the fruit flies find it, before it turns. Nothing about that moment feels like deep history. It feels like snack time. A reflex, a small pleasure, gone in under a minute. But the hand holding that mango, the eyes that spotted its color from across a kitchen, the mouth already watering before the first bite landed, those are running a program that is not yours. It belongs to something that lived tens of millions of years before a single human being existed. The question of when humans first started eating fruit sounds like it should have a tidy answer. A moment, a place, a first taste. It doesn't. And the honest answer is stranger than a first bite, because the craving for fruit is older than humans, older than apes, older than most of the mammals you could name. Picture a canopy that no longer exists. Warm, dense, dripping forest. Somewhere in what would one day become the tropics, more than 55 million years ago, flowering plants had only recently taken over the world's forests. And for the first time in Earth's history, trees were producing something genuinely new. Fleshy, sugar-packed, brightly colored fruit, built by the plant for one purpose only. Get eaten, get carried, get the seeds inside spread somewhere new. Into that opportunity climbed the earliest primates. Small, nocturnal, mostly insect-eating creatures that had no idea they were about to enter one of the strangest partnerships in the history of life on Earth. This wasn't a minor dietary shift. In a world where insects were scattered and unpredictable, and leaves were abundant but hard to digest, fruit offered something almost nowhere else in the forest did. Concentrated, fast-burning energy, wrapped in a soft package that barely needed chewing. There was a catch. Fruit doesn't advertise itself to everyone equally. It ripens on a schedule the animal can't control, in a location the animal has to remember, and it competes for attention with birds, insects, and every other fruit-hungry creature in the canopy. Finding it once was luck. Finding it consistently, season after season, tree after tree, was the actual skill, and the animals that got better at it had an advantage the leaf eaters simply didn't. That pressure would leave a mark. Not in a journal, not in a memory, but in the eyes. Most mammals see a comparatively narrow slice of the color spectrum. Two types of color receptor, tuned mainly to detect motion and contrast against green, which is more than enough if you're a nocturnal creature dodging predators in dim light. But somewhere in the primate lineage, a third type of color receptor appeared, sensitive to a different wavelength entirely, the one that makes ripe fruit glow red and orange against a sea of green leaves. Researchers Nathaniel Dominy and Peter Lucas published a study in Nature in 2001, examining exactly this question, comparing trichromatic vision, the 3-receptor version, against the fruit detection abilities of old-world monkeys in the wild. Their conclusion was almost uncomfortably practical. Full-color vision in primates lines up strikingly well with the specific task of spotting ripe, energy-dense fruit against foliage from a distance, faster and more reliably than 2-color vision ever could. In other words, the reason so many primates, including you, see the world in full color may not be about beauty or nuance at all. It may be about produce. Here's where it gets genuinely counterintuitive. We tend to picture our ancestors as opportunistic omnivores who happen to eat some fruit along the way, with meat and hunting doing the real work of building a bigger, smarter brain. The fruit evidence tells a more complicated story, and in some ways, a more foundational one. Fruit isn't just sitting there waiting to be found. It's scattered unevenly across a landscape, ripening on different trees at different times, and then gone within days once it does. An animal that depends heavily on fruit has to solve a genuinely difficult cognitive problem. Where are the trees? When will each one ripen? And how do I get there before something else does? The primatologist Katharine Milton spent years studying exactly this pressure in wild primate populations, comparing species that rely heavily on fruit against close relatives that rely mainly on leaves. Her research, published across multiple studies in the 1980s and 1990s, found a consistent pattern. Fruit-eating primates tend to have measurably larger brains relative to their body size than leaf-eating primates living in the same forests, eating the same general environment, facing the same predators. Her explanation wasn't about intelligence in some abstract sense. It was about memory. Leaves are everywhere and don't move. Fruit is rare, temporary, and demands a mental map. Tracking dozens of trees across a territory, remembering which ones fruited last month and which ones are due next, rewards a bigger, more capable brain in a way that eating leaves off the nearest branch simply doesn't. That's not a minor detail buried in an old field study. That's a plausible answer to one of the biggest questions in primate evolution, sitting quietly inside the fruit bowl. None of this means early primates were living some kind of endless orchard. Fruiting seasons are unpredictable. Trees compete for pollinators, and then compete again for the animals willing to eat and disperse their seeds. A creature with a strong drive toward ripe, sugar-rich fruit had a real edge in that competition, provided its brain and its eyes were good enough to find the fruit before it rotted or vanished into someone else's stomach. That pressure didn't disappear when the hominin lineage split off from other apes millions of years later. It changed shape and it left evidence in places you wouldn't expect to look. One of the strangest pieces of that evidence isn't behavioral at all. It's genetic, and it's broken. Almost every mammal on Earth can manufacture its own vitamin C internally, using an enzyme controlled by a gene called gulo. Humans can't. Neither can any other primate in our branch of the family tree. Somewhere around 61 million years ago, according to genetic research led by biochemist Morimitsu Nishikimi, a mutation disabled that gene in an early primate ancestor, and it has stayed disabled in every descendant since, including you. That should be a serious liability. Vitamin C isn't optional. Without it, connective tissue breaks down and the body eventually fails, which is exactly what happens in scurvy. And yet this broken gene has persisted for tens of millions of years across an entire branch of mammals, without being corrected by evolution. The explanation researchers point to is almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. The mutation never mattered, because the animals carrying it were already eating enough ripe fruit to get all the vitamin C they needed from their diet, every single day, without exception. A gene doesn't get repaired by evolution if it's never actually being tested. Losing the ability to make your own vitamin C is only a survivable mistake if you never stop eating the thing that already contains it. Sit with that for a second. Your body isn't just fond of fruit. At a genetic level, it is structurally dependent on it, because somewhere around 61 million years ago, an ancestor of yours got so consistently fed by fruit that the backup system quietly switched off and never switched back on. It isn't only primates that this happened to. Guinea pigs lost the same gene independently. So did most fruit bats. So did a handful of bird species. In every single case researchers have studied, the animals carrying a disabled gulo gene share one thing in common: a diet reliable enough in fruit, nectar, or other vitamin C-rich food that the ability to manufacture it internally became, evolutionarily speaking, dead weight. Losing a backup system is only affordable if the main supply never fails you. For tens of millions of years, across an entire branch of the animal kingdom, fruit didn't fail. By the time recognizably human ancestors show up in the fossil record, the relationship with fruit had already been running for tens of millions of years. What changed wasn't the craving, it was the environment. Around 3 to 4 million years ago, in the woodlands of eastern and southern Africa, early hominins like Australopithecus were living in landscapes that were shrinking and drying, patchworks of forest giving way to more open, seasonal terrain. Dental microwear studies on Australopithecus afarensis teeth, the same species as the famous skeleton known as Lucy, conducted by researchers including Peter Ungar, show a mix of wear patterns consistent with soft fruit for much of the year, but with signs of harder, tougher fallback foods appearing during specific seasons, likely when preferred fruit simply wasn't available. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. It suggests these early hominins weren't fruit specialists by choice alone. They were fruit specialists by preference, forced periodically into harder, less desirable food by a landscape that couldn't guarantee ripe fruit year-round the way ancient rainforests once could. The tension between what the body wanted and what the season provided didn't resolve. It just kept getting passed forward, generation after generation, forest after shrinking forest. Further back, in slightly older hominins like Ardipithecus ramidus, isotope and dental evidence, examined by researchers including geochemist Naomi Levin, points to a diet still heavily woven around fruit and other woodland plant foods, in an environment that was more forested than the one Lucy's species would later inhabit. Read those two fossil snapshots side by side, and a pattern starts to emerge. As African landscapes dried and fragmented over a few million years, hominin diets didn't abandon fruit by choice. They were pushed away from it, in stages, one shrinking forest at a time, forced to fall back on tougher foods only when the preferred option simply wasn't there. Which raises an obvious question. If wild fruit was this unreliable, scattered, seasonal, gone within days of ripening, when did people stop simply searching for it and start growing it on purpose? The answer comes from an unusually specific piece of archaeology, and it doesn't point where most people would guess. In 2006, a team led by archaeobotanist Mordecai Kislev published findings in the journal Science describing carbonized fig remains recovered from a site called Gilgal 1 in the Jordan Valley. The figs were radiocarbon dated to roughly 11,400 to 11,200 years ago. What made them remarkable wasn't just their age. It was their type. These weren't wild figs capable of pollinating and reproducing naturally. They were a parthenocarpic variety, meaning they could only be propagated by humans, deliberately taking cuttings and replanting them, generation after generation, without relying on wild pollination at all. In other words, someone had already domesticated this fig tree, and they had done it roughly 1,000 years before the earliest confirmed domestication of wheat or barley in the same region. Fruit, not grain, may have been humanity's first deliberately cultivated crop. Long before anyone planted a field of cereal expecting a harvest months later, someone was already taking cuttings from a favorite fig tree and starting a new one nearby, chasing a taste that had been shaping primate behavior for tens of millions of years. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it inverts a story most people take for granted. Agriculture is usually framed as beginning with grain, with bread, with the birth of granaries and calendars and settled farming villages built around a harvest. The fig evidence suggests something quieter happened first. Someone simply refused to keep gambling on when the next wild fruit tree would ripen and decided to grow the sweetness themselves. From there, the story of fruit domestication becomes a story of quiet, patient transformation, stretched across thousands of years and multiple continents. Wild apples, the ancestor species Malus sieversii, still grow in the mountains of Central Asia today, and they look almost nothing like the apple in a modern grocery store. Smaller, more bitter, wildly inconsistent from tree to tree, some barely edible at all. Researchers studying the genetics of modern apple varieties, including work led by botanist Barry Juniper, have traced a long, deliberate lineage of selection, stretching back thousands of years. Farmers and traders repeatedly choosing to replant the sweetest, largest, most reliable trees they found, and discard the rest. The same pattern shows up almost everywhere fruit has been cultivated. Wild bananas are packed with hard seeds and barely any edible flesh. Wild strawberries are a fraction of the size of anything sold today. Wild peaches were smaller, tartar, and far more work for far less reward. Every sweet, seedless, oversized fruit sitting in a modern kitchen is the end result of thousands of years of humans nudging a genuinely ancient craving towards something the wild world was never generous enough to provide on its own. And this wasn't happening in one place. It was happening almost everywhere, on separate continents, in populations with no contact with each other at all. In the highlands of New Guinea, wild bananas were being selectively propagated by around 7,000 years ago, cuttings taken from the plants with the least seed and the most starch. The same logic driving fig propagation on the other side of the planet. In the Persian Gulf, archaeological evidence from sites in what is now the United Arab Emirates and Iraq shows date palms under deliberate cultivation by roughly 5000 BCE, in a landscape where almost nothing else sweet grew at all. In China, citrus trees were being grafted and selectively bred by at least the 2nd century BCE, a technique advanced enough that ancient Chinese agricultural texts describe grafting methods in detail. None of these populations were reading each other's notes. They arrived, independently, at the same conclusion. Wild fruit was worth the effort of controlling, worth the years of patient selection, worth building an entire agricultural relationship around, long before most of these same regions had settled into full-scale grain farming. The craving didn't wait for civilization to organize itself. It pulled agriculture toward it from multiple directions at once. That is the real hinge this story turns on. Not the first bite of wild fruit tens of millions of years ago. Not even the first fig cutting planted deliberately in the Jordan Valley. The rupture is the scale and reliability of what came after, as farmers across separate continents spent thousands of years quietly breeding fruit to be sweeter, bigger, and easier than anything a primate brain evolved to find in the wild. Your craving for fruit was never built for a grocery store aisle stocked year-round with fruit bred to be sweeter than its wild ancestors ever were. It was built for a canopy where the sweetest thing available might ripen for 2 weeks a year on one particular tree, if you remembered where that tree was, and got there before something else did. The craving is tens of millions of years old. The supply, sweet, abundant, available in every season regardless of what any forest is doing, is not. Almost everything about how fruit affects appetite now, how easy it is to eat past the point of hunger, how a bowl of grapes can disappear without you quite noticing, comes from that mismatch. Not from a flaw in anyone's character, from biology meeting an abundance it was never designed to expect. For nearly the entire span of primate history, wanting fruit and getting fruit were two very different things, separated by a forest, a season, and a fair amount of luck. Only in the last few thousand years, a rounding error against 60 million, did the gap between wanting and getting start closing completely. Your senses never got the memo. As far as your biology is concerned, that mango should be rare, seasonal, and worth remembering the location of. Instead, it's sitting in a bowl on the counter, available on demand, indistinguishable from every other mango in every other bowl in every other kitchen on the same street. Which brings you back to the mango. Juice on your wrist, sweetness already registering on your tongue before you've even swallowed. It isn't asking anything difficult of you. It doesn't need you to memorize a forest, track a fruiting season, or outcompete a troop of rival primates for the last ripe branch. It just needs you to reach for it, the way something in your biology has been built to do since long before there were humans to do the reaching, and long before there was a single orchard on Earth. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Every week we dig into stories like this one, about ancient human behavior, about what your body still quietly remembers, about the gap between the world your instincts were built for and the one you're actually living in.